I have to thank Eric and Mark. As we were designing and launching T3 in Tarrant County, we relied on them relentlessly. And they helped kind of guide our thought process, our design process, all the way from the beginning. So I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Jay McCall. My permanent job is Program Manager of Education at the Rainwater Charitable Foundation. Right before the pandemic, I basically went on loan to serve as the acting executive director for T3 during that kind of weird time. So I've done that for about the last 18 months, but super excited that we found our permanent executive director in Natalie and to see where she's going to take the organization. So what we want to do is share a little bit about our program design to make sure that you have the groundwork for what our approach to the work is and where we see our value proposition in the system. And then let Natalie talk a little bit more about how we're going to use data to case manage and serve kids better. So, okay, so first I think it's really important to mention that, you know, our mission is really about ensuring that every student has some sort of post-secondary credential, right? That they have a pathway and a plan for themselves after graduation. It's also really important for us to put guardrails in. That is our mission. We're not going to go off into all of these other things. It is about the traditional student finding a pathway after graduation for us, right? And so that is the place that we want to see ourselves playing in the system. It takes a broad group, and so I think the other thing that's important, we spent almost a full 18 months before we actually mentioned this or launched this, going around the country with an advisory council to figure out what the best practices were. And we had representation with Dr. Sines at Fort Worth ISD, Dr. Coppola from TCC, several other community leaders. We held focus groups with parents, students, educators, before we ever said, hey, this is T3 and this is what we're gonna do. So it was really important for us to intentionally take that time to build a broad coalition of stakeholders and funding base before we ever launched anything. So I talked about the value add. Obviously, T3 is not a K-12 system. It's not an institution of higher ed. It's not a government that is funded or a government agency that is funded. So what we want to do is make sure that we're being additive to the system. And so when we looked out, we said, where are the gaps? Where can we plug in? If we're going to make an investment and we're going to bring partners to the table, we need to make sure that we're not wasting their time and duplicating efforts, right? And so one of our guiding principles before I launch into where we kind of are trying to close the gaps is to build on the existing work that's already happening. And that's something that we've kind of like beaten into our heads, is there is so much great work going out there. We need to expand, we need to amplify, and then bring those practices in where they can be scaled, right? And so that's kind of, I think, important context for us setting. So when we talk about the system as it is now, our number one thing is really closing that information gap. And I don't mean that just from a education standpoint. It's really about bringing in that changing economy and what are the requirements of the future workforce going to be, and pulling in that business and then pushing that out to students and families. And so I think we find, no matter what your endeavor is in the education world, when students and families have better information, when they understand the pathways and the options, outcomes improve, right? And so for us, like looking out and seeing there's all these amazing supports, there's all these amazing pathways that are connecting to high demand, high wage jobs, and people don't know about it. And so that's one place that we think we can leverage technology and relationships to make sure that we're filling that gap and pushing that information out through multiple channels with adequate resources to make sure that they understand that. Second is changing the expectations gap. And so while we are not a straight promise program, we love the value add of placing that flag in the community and saying every student has a pathway, and we can create an affordable pathway for a plan for some sort of degree or credential. And so that really helps boost that expectation that, you know, across the community, no matter what high school you're in, this is for you, actually. Like, the workforce is for you. Success is for you. And so how do we do that? And so we know we need to solve that gap. right? And there's multiple ways to do it, but that is I think one of the realities that like we can't technology our way out of it. We can't do anything. You've got to sit down with the kids and understand what they want to do and guide and kind of shepherd them through that process. And so we're trying to do that at scale. And then fourth is the financial aid gap. We know that there's fundraising we can do for scholarships, but it's also about connecting to existing resources that are already there. And so how can we highlight those? And again, the information gap, right? Like making sure they're connected to those opportunities. Okay, so that's kind of the idea, right? Let's solve those gaps. So what are the actual tactical things that we're doing from a program component standpoint? So we have a couple of the team back here. When we started, we hired these young, talented, amazing people. Two of them are back there, Raj and Richard. Raj does the IT. Richard does the K-12 pathways work. We have another, Rachel. So to me, it was like the 3 Rs are out there just killing it, crushing it, designing these programs in partnership with our institutions, right? And so all of this was designed in partnership with Fort Worth ISD and our institutions of higher ed. So increased college and career navigation and advising services. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the second slide. Then the pledge campaign, which you guys are familiar with, I think, which is probably your typical promise approach. Parent and family engagement. We're launching this January and February kind of the parent university with a focus on how do you make sure that your entire family understands what it means to be CCMR ready, right? And partnering with their parent liaisons at every middle school in Fort Worth ISD to push that out, and then piloting it at 2 or 3 middle schools intentionally. And then working with the Fort Worth ISD team on how do we embed some of this career exploration in a coursework that all 8th grade students can go through and understand what those options are, even as they're choosing the high schools, right? And then engaging with the business community. We know, we heard through focus groups, and we see it in the data, that when students are exposed to career, when they are connected to industry mentors, that's a really powerful motivator, and it's a really powerful tool to help them realize that this is the end goal instead of just sitting back and hearing about it. So we've launched T3 Connects, which helps industry mentors connect with students. And then we have a partnership with the Student Success Agency where any student has access to a virtual online mentor through the Student Success Agency. Then I mentioned Rachel on the second, so that's kind of all the to work, and then the through work is the persistence piece. So working with our higher ed partners on targeted bridge programming, increased persistence coaching, and then certainly transfer support. So we know that TCC is one of our biggest partners. We know that UTA and Tarleton are a couple of our biggest partners. And so how can we make sure that those transfer students are supported, like all the way through? And then most importantly, I think the reason most of us are here today is from a technology standpoint, how do we put all of that onto one system so that we can case manage and understand where students are? And that piece is how we're going to get to scale, right? And so whenever we think about securing these data sharing agreements and MOUs with our institutions of higher ed, making sure that they are then funneling onto Salesforce, and that's what Natalie's going to talk about a little bit, and then targeted, customized case management, right? That's the only way, because we're not talking about, we don't want to run a program for a couple hundred kids here and there, right? And I don't mean that disparaging, but when we have tens of thousands of kids not realizing the success that we would all want for our own kids every single year, we've got to think about leveraging technology. Okay, so the one thing that I did want to mention is all of our partner colleges and universities. This represents about 65%, I think, of all the students that go to college from Fort Worth ISD, this is where they're going. The one that's not up there is UNT Denton, and we're working on that. But you know, it's important for us to deploy resources where we know most of our kids are going to go. So every one of these partners, they've signed a formal data sharing agreement, right? So we're going to get all that data that we saw on the last presentation and able to help students understand where they are in the process and then reach out to them in real time, right? So I think that's important to understand, is like all of the groundwork that it takes to build that trust and to actually get those formal agreements in place. So what I do want to talk about is our partnership with the TCU College Advising Corps. And so when we were launching T3, before that, we did a national search. Who is doing like a dedicated near-peer advising program in around the country? And it just so happened that the College Advising Corps has had a partnership with TCU in our own backyard for a long time. And so we fundraised around this, and in partnership with the TCU College Advising Corps, we placed last year 30 additional advisors in 6 launch high schools with a manageable caseload of students to where they're going to sit down and work with those seniors, but all the way down, have a caseload all the way down into the freshman year. And so when you put 5 or 6 additional advisors, depending on the high school, the size of the high school, in there with a dedicated focus on this is the pathway, right? And so it was important for us to have a third party that was not a district employee to keep that dedicated focus. And Fort Worth ISD was totally on board with it, to their credit. So again, these are near peer advisors. These are recent TCU graduates that oftentimes came from these very similar demographic schools. They are embedded, they are full-time. The way this works, they make a very moderate salary of $29,000, but I have to give kudos to TCU because they kick in free grad school for these advisors. And so that's how we're able to get the talented people and kids that we have. I should not say kids. Recent college graduates that are embedded in the schools. So again, these are our advisors. Again, I think it's important to note, so that was, we launched with 30 last year. We expanded to 52 this year using ESSER funds because Fort Worth ISD was very encouraged by the results that we got right off the bat. 39 were first gen to college, 34 were Pell eligible, and 30 graduated from a partner district that TCU supports. So it's really important. These are the kids that are, these are the young people that are embedded in our high schools, right? So with that being said, thanks for listening to me ramble a little bit, and I want to introduce Natalie, who we're so excited about pulling some Dallas talent over to Fort Worth. So.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and be a part of T3 Partnership. Certainly our mission is very near and dear to my heart. I recently came from Paul Quinn College, where I was President Sorrell's Chief of Staff and over the corporate work program. And now I can take all of that knowledge and those connections and transition it to what we're doing in Tarrant County with T3 and bring on board a whole new group of corporate partners in the greater Tarrant County area. So one of the things that I think Jay has mentioned is just our continuum, the way that we go about supporting our students that are T3 scholars. And what you're seeing in this graph here is just our entire model. And within that model, it's not just, programs, it's intentional programming that works one-on-one, that's individualized, that supports the students. You have the scholarships and financial aid, but you also have the mentoring, you have transfer student support. So our goal in our model is designed to take students from the point when they're at middle school and get them all the way to and through. And so we have a team that's dedicated to working with them when they are in their high schools, when they're in their middle schools, and then we have a team that's dedicated to continuing to work with the students when they persist and go on to one of our partner institutions. So I do want to move on and spend a little bit more time talking about data. One of the things that impressed me about T3 and the partnership and the connection with EMS and Dallas County Promise is the work that our IT team has done to create these very robust dashboards and data insights within our Salesforce system. And you see one slide up there that's just a small snapshot where we're tracking students and their completion of FAFSA, but we look at all kinds of different data and want to make sure I don't forget all of the various data points that we have. But we look at the data and we use that as insight so that we can do a couple of things. One, we want to scale. So as Jay mentioned, we want to make sure that we're able to support thousands of students and scale. And then we also want to be able to pivot quickly. So if we're looking at insights, if we're taking a look at our students and what is their path, what's been successful for them, how is that translated to when they're in college, and what insights can we gain from that to ensure that we're adding value not only to our ISD partners, but also adding value and giving those insights to our partner institutions. So we have data sharing agreements that allows us to have data from our partner institutions, from Fort Worth ISD. We work with our IT team to ensure that all of that data is compiled into dashboards that we use on a very consistent basis to make sure that we're getting the insights that we need to grow and develop our program, make those tweaks in real time. So I just want to, I know we've covered a lot of information, talked a lot about T3 and just our model. I think the only things that I would want to just conclude with is that it's important for our students to have many options when they graduate from high school. So how do they leverage and utilize those certifications to stack them that leads to full-time, employment? Or some students who may have certifications or graduated with, dual certification, how do you then take those maybe immediately upon high school graduation and translate that into jobs or employment? And that's where our corporate partners, our mentoring, all of that comes into play to ensure that we have a very individualized experience for our students and that we're able to connect them to the path that is going to be most meaningful and fulfilling for them. So I want to just take this opportunity to thank the entire EMS team and Dr. Ban and certainly Envision for supporting us and putting this together. This has been a great opportunity for me to be introduced to new potential partners, see some of the folks that have worked behind the scenes. So thank you for allowing us to be here to share a little bit more about T3.